The death of Antonio Vasconcelos shook everyone, but for very different reasons. For some, it was the loss of a man of integrity, a patriarch whose word was law. For others, it was the end of a life full of secrets and broken promises. The news of his death spread quickly among the heirs, each dealing with the situation in their own way. Camila, the rejected daughter, did not shed a tear at her mother's side, who had already made it clear that the young woman was not welcome. Felipe, the stepson who grew up without a place to call his own, felt only a familiar emptiness. Marina, the neglected granddaughter, relived the years of her grandmother's abuse as she faced the cold stares of the assembled relatives. Gabriel, the betrayed heir, tried to understand how the empire that should have been his had been ripped from his hands. And Laura, the forgotten daughter, searched for answers among the old papers in her father's office, while Daniela and Tiago prepared to fight over the house where they grew up. But nothing could prepare them for what was about to happen. Antonio's will was read in a stuffy room, with an experienced but visibly uncomfortable lawyer. The document was supposed to clarify who would inherit what, but instead it brought to light lies that had been buried for years. Bruno, the deceived friend, listened attentively, waiting for his name to be mentioned, but all he heard was the sound of his own naivety echoing in his mind. Alana, the estranged granddaughter, tried to decipher her grandfather's logic, while Gustavo smiled next to his suddenly convenient fiancé. Juliana felt her stomach turn as Eduardo, her brother, settled into his chair as if he already knew the outcome. Rodrigo, who had spent years caring for his sick uncle, felt his blood run cold when he heard that everything that had been promised to him now belonged to a distant cousin. When the lawyer finished reading, the silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. No one had gotten out of there as expected. And then, the discoveries began. The tension in the room was almost palpable. Eyes met, some filled with disbelief, others with pure fury. Camila felt her chest tighten when she realized that her mother wasn't even pretending to be surprised at seeing her disinherited. On the contrary, there was a certain relief on her face, as if she were finally getting rid of a weight. But then something caught her attention. The lawyer cleared his throat and pulled out an envelope that was different from the others. "There is a bank account in the name of Camila Vasconcelos," he announced, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath at the same time. "Your father left this amount specifically for you, out of anyone else's reach." Her mother's face contorted with anger. The woman advanced on the table, demanding explanations, but the lawyer's answer was simple and cutting: "Your husband knew what he was doing." Meanwhile, in a corner of the room, Felipe tried to control the wave of anger rising in his throat. He had grown up hearing that he had no rights to anything, that he was an intruder in his own mother's house. Now, hearing that everything had been left to his stepfather, he felt as if he were being kicked out again. But it was when the lawyer mentioned a name he hadn't expected that the situation changed. His biological father, a man he barely remembered, had left him something. For years, he had sent him money, saving it for a moment like this. Felipe looked at the lawyer, trying to understand how a stranger could care more than his own mother. But the most important question was another: why had they hidden this from him for so long? Marina, who had remained silent until then, felt a lump in her throat when she saw her name completely ignored in the will. After years of caring for her sick grandmother, suffering daily humiliations, all that was left for her was a pile of bitter memories. But something didn't make sense. Her cousin, the one who barely showed up to visit the old woman, had inherited everything. Marina knew that her grandmother had never treated her with affection, but she hadn't expected to be discarded like this. That's when something came to her mind. The day she found a crumpled envelope at the bottom of a drawer in her grandmother's room. At the time, she hadn't paid it any attention, but now she clearly remembered what was written in the upper corner: "To Marina, read when I'm no longer here." The bad feeling in her stomach intensified. If the will had been changed, there might be something in that note that explained why. Across the room, Gabriel tried to process what he had heard. For years, his father had groomed him to run the family business. He knew every detail of the business, every decision made over the years. But now, it all belonged to his stepmother, a woman half his father's age and twice as smart. The lawyer explained that legally, the company had been transferred to her before his father's death. It had been a careful move, made shortly before the patriarch passed away. But Gabriel knew something was wrong. His father would never do this on purpose. His hands clenched into fists, he decided he would not accept this defeat without a fight. If his father had tried to right a wrong before he died, then Gabriel needed to find out what had really happened, and, more importantly, who had stopped him. Laura kept her expression neutral, but inside, her blood was boiling. Her father had always been a distant man, someone who seemed more like an occasional visitor than a real father figure. She had never expected much from him, but still, finding out that everything had been passed down to her stepmother and half-siblings made her sick. Hadn't he even bothered to leave her anything? The answer seemed obvious. But when she returned to the family's old house that night, she found something that made her heart race, an old notebook, forgotten, at the bottom of a dusty drawer. Opening the pages, she recognized her father's handwriting. Amidst the notes about work and investments, one sentence stood out. "To Laura, my daughter, my greatest guilt." The words made her chest tighten. There was something he wanted her to know, something he had never been able to say in life. Meanwhile, Daniela refused to accept the decision in the will. Her brother, Tiago, had received everything, house, possessions, and even the small plot of land that their father had in the neighboring city. As if she didn't even exist. Tiago, in turn, could barely hide his satisfied smile, saying that it was better this way, that she would understand one day. But Daniela never bought her brother's excuses. There was something rotten there, she could feel it in her skin. So she decided to start looking through the old documents of the house. And that's how she found her mother's death certificate. But there was one strange detail. The cause of death was blurred out, as if someone had tried to erase it. Her heart raced. Everyone had always said that her mother had died of a sudden illness. But what if that wasn't quite the case? Bruno felt sick to his stomach as he listened to the lawyer list the family's assets, expecting to hear his name at some point. But it never came. He looked at Mateus, his former best friend, and saw the satisfied expression on his face. That was when the penny dropped. When his parents died, Bruno had trusted Mateus blindly to help him run the family's small business. He had signed documents without reading them, trusted the word of a childhood friend. And now, there was nothing left. Everything was in Mateus' name. He tried to argue, but the lawyer just shook his head, showing the signed papers. It was official. Bruno had been deceived, robbed by the only friend he believed was his family after his parents' death. The question was, would he let it go or would he fight to reverse the fatal mistake he had made? Alana crossed her arms, listening silently as her cousin Gustavo became the largest beneficiary of her grandfather's inheritance. None of this was a surprise. What really shocked her was the way it had happened. According to the will, whoever was engaged at the time of the old man's death would inherit the bulk of the fortune. And Gustavo, conveniently enough, was engaged to none other than her best friend. This was a joke, a setup so blatant that Alana wondered how no one else saw it coming. But she wouldn't let it go. If Gustavo and her friend had planned this scam, there had to be trails. Conversations, documents, anything that would prove the manipulation. Her grandfather might have made a mistake in creating this absurd clause in the will, but Alana wouldn't make the mistake of accepting it without a fight. Juliana felt a tightness in her chest when she saw her brother, Eduardo, acting as if everything had always belonged to him. While she spent years taking care of her sick mother, he lived abroad, showing no signs of life. Now, he returned only to sell the house where they grew up and pocket the money, without even asking her opinion. But something didn't make sense. Juliana knew that her mother would never have left everything to Eduardo. She had spent her entire life listening to her mother say that she wanted her to keep the house. So why did Eduardo now have the power to sell it without any objection? Restless, she began to rummage through the few belongings that remained in the property. And then she found a yellowed envelope hidden in the back of a closet. Inside was a document that took her breath away. The house had never been in Eduardo's name. The signature on the transfer paper was suspicious. Something was very wrong, and she wouldn't let it go. Rodrigo felt his world fall apart when he learned that the apartment where he had lived for years, taking care of his sick uncle, now belonged to a distant cousin he didn't even know very well. His uncle had always promised him that he would inherit the property. After everything Rodrigo had done for him, it was the least he could leave. But somehow, the will had been changed weeks before his death. Rodrigo tried to understand how that was possible. And then, a disturbing idea began to take shape. His uncle hadn't been well in the last few weeks. He seemed confused, sleepy, different from his usual self. And now, knowing that the will had been changed at the last minute, Rodrigo couldn't help but suspect that perhaps his uncle hadn't simply passed away of natural causes. Perhaps someone had made sure he wasn't lucid enough to realize what he was signing. The silence in the lawyer's office had already turned into a suffocating tension. Each heir, or at least those who hoped to be heirs, was processing the bitter truth that was unfolding before them. But there was something even more unsettling in the air. The will didn't just reveal injustices, betrayals, and manipulations, it exposed a pattern. It was as if, somehow, each one there had been a victim of a larger game, a game that had begun long before Antonio Vasconcelos's death. It was at that moment that Camila, still digesting the news that her father had protected her in secret, noticed something strange. The lawyer hesitated, as if he knew more than he was saying. His gaze strayed from the indignant faces around the table, and his hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder of documents. "Is that all?" she asked, keeping her tone firm. The man swallowed hard before answering, "That's all, for now." The answer hung in the air like a storm about to break. Felipe was the first to stand up, feeling a growing uneasiness. The money left by his biological father, the surprise that he had tried to take care of him from a distance, all of this seemed like a piece of a larger puzzle. Marina, holding the envelope she had found in her grandmother's drawer, knew she had to read it, but feared what she would discover. Gabriel, now convinced that his stepmother had masterminded everything, wondered how far the manipulations went. Daniela, clutching the paper of her mother's suspicious death certificate, felt a shiver run down her spine. They had been deceived, each in their own way. But what if it wasn't just bad luck? What if it was all connected? Doubt began to spread among them like a virus. It was no longer just about stolen inheritances or manipulated wills, it was about something bigger, something that perhaps neither of them had seen before. Camila, now with control over the secret account left by her father, realized that the money was not just a precaution against her mother. It was a message. A warning that her father knew something was about to happen. But what? Felipe, still trying to absorb the revelation about his biological father, began to question the gaps in his own story. How had his mother managed to hide this truth for so long? Who had benefited from her ignorance? Marina, for her part, opened the envelope with trembling hands. What she found inside made her stomach drop, an incomplete letter written in haste by her grandmother, confessing something about a change of plans and a mistake that needed to be corrected. Mistake? What mistake? Gabriel couldn't shake the feeling that his father had somehow tried to fix what was wrong before he died. But someone stopped him. He looked around the room, seeing the same growing uneasiness on the faces of the others. Juliana held the document that proved that the house had never belonged to Eduardo. Rodrigo could no longer ignore the suspicion that his uncle had been manipulated until the end. Bruno, feeling like an idiot for trusting Mateus, now understood that this wasn't just a betrayal between friends, but something much more calculated. And then Daniela broke the silence. "What if none of this is a coincidence?" she said, her voice cutting through the heavy air. Everyone turned to her. What if someone planned this? The impact of those words plunged the entire room into a tense silence. Until that moment, each person had interpreted their own tragedy as a personal misfortune, an isolated betrayal. But now, the idea that everything could be connected sent a chill down everyone's spine. Camila stared at Daniela, trying to understand if she was just saying that out of anger or if she really had something concrete in mind. Planned by who? Bruno asked, his voice thick with frustration. Daniela opened the folder she was holding and threw onto the table a copy of her father's original will, something she had found hidden among the old documents in the house. "This says that I should inherit half of the house. But strangely, my brother got a different document, signed weeks before our father's death. Does it sound familiar to anyone here?" It was as if a spark had lit a powder keg. Marina stepped forward and placed her letter on the table. "My grandmother also changed her will at the last minute." Gabriel snorted, throwing an envelope with some papers. "My father did the same, before he died. And don't ask me how, but I know he tried to reverse the decision." Rodrigo looked at everyone, his heart racing. My uncle too. Felipe, who had been silent until then, opened his mouth slowly, as if he were connecting the dots in real time. The money my father left me, why did he do it in secret? Maybe he knew someone would try to stop me from receiving it. Alana clenched her fists, still digesting the humiliation of seeing her name erased from her grandfather's will. This can't be a coincidence. Juliana, holding the document that proved Eduardo shouldn't have inherited the house, looked around. If everything was manipulated, who was behind it? The weight of that question hung in the air, filled with uncertainty and fear. Who had enough power to manipulate so many wills, convince relatives to sign suspicious documents, and ensure that all of these inheritances were diverted? Felipe felt a chill run down his spine when he realized that, in almost all cases, the documents had been altered shortly before the victims' deaths. Marina looked at her grandmother's unfinished letter and wondered if the old woman had really had time to change her mind or if someone had helped her pass away faster. Rodrigo, now more certain than ever that his uncle had been deceived, began to put the pieces together. What if it wasn't just one person? What if this is bigger than we imagine? Everyone looked at each other, the idea starting to make sense. Could such a well-orchestrated scheme have been carried out by a single person? Or was there a group of people operating in the shadows, taking advantage of vulnerable families? Camila, who had been trying to remain rational until then, began to feel increasingly restless. Her father had left her money hidden, yes, but what did that mean? Did he know something was wrong? Did he know her mother would try to throw her out of the house as soon as he died? And more than that, did he know that other families were going through the same thing? Gabriel, feeling anger growing inside him, clenched his fists. This was planned. And no matter who is behind this, I will find out. Daniela nodded, determined. If there is a pattern, there is a trail for us to follow. And if there is a trail, we can find the origin. Everyone there had lost something. But now, what mattered was not just recovering what was theirs. It was finding out the truth before it was too late. The search for the truth began right there, amidst suspicious glances and papers scattered across the lawyer's desk. Each person had a piece of the story, a loose thread that, if pulled in the right way, could reveal something much bigger. Felipe was the first to act. He got the lawyer's contact information and demanded an official copy of his mother's original will. He wanted to know if there were any irregularities in the documents signed years ago. Marina, still processing the revelation of her grandmother's unfinished letter, decided to return to the house where she had spent so much time as a caretaker. If that woman had kept a secret until the last moment, perhaps there were more clues there. Bruno, still digesting Mateus' betrayal, realized he needed an expert, someone who understood business fraud. His former accountant might be able to help him track down the paperwork that had transferred his company without him noticing. Meanwhile, Alana had an advantage. She knew exactly who had benefited from the absurd clause in her grandfather's will. Gustavo and his fake fiancée may have planned the whole thing, but had they left any traces? With her heart racing, she decided to follow the only solid lead she had, the records from the registry office where the supposed engagement had been registered. If the scam had been staged, then there had to be a flaw somewhere. Gabriel, determined to find out how his stepmother had managed to transfer the company into her name, returned to his father's office, sifting through old documents. If he was right, his father had tried to change everything at the last minute. But someone had stopped him. What if that someone had a connection to the other stories? Juliana felt her heart pounding in her chest as she analyzed every detail of the document that proved that Eduardo should never have inherited the house. If her mother really intended to leave her the property, who made everything change? She decided to go to the notary's office and pull up records of the changes made in the last months of her mother's life. If there was anything suspicious, the paperwork would show it. Meanwhile, Rodrigo couldn't shake the idea that his uncle had been manipulated in the last days of his life. Who had access to him? Who convinced him to sign a will that undid all the promises he had made for years? He decided to go to the hospital, where his uncle was hospitalized in his final weeks. If someone had pressured him to change the papers, perhaps a nurse or employee could remember something unusual. As they each went their separate ways, Camila decided to look at her situation from another angle. Her father hadn't just hidden money for her, he'd done it in a hurry, as if he were preparing for something inevitable. But how had he known he had to act? Was it a hunch? Or had he discovered something and not had time to tell her? Rummaging through her father's old belongings, she found something that made her freeze, a business card from a law firm, with a name highlighted in red. When she searched online, she discovered that the lawyer was involved in an investigation into inheritance fraud and family disputes. What did her father know? And, more importantly, did this lawyer have answers to the questions that were haunting everyone there? Daniela felt a shiver run down her spine as she looked at her mother's death certificate again. Something was wrong, and now she was sure. If the cause of death had been tampered with, who had done it? And why? Wasting no time, she grabbed the document and went to an old family friend, a doctor who had known her mother since she was young. When he looked at the certificate, he frowned. "This doesn't match her medical records," he said hesitantly. Daniela felt her stomach sink. "Does that mean someone changed the cause of death?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "I can't say anything without proof, but, if you want to know the truth, you need to get the original medical records from the hospital." Daniela nodded, feeling adrenaline rush through her body. If someone had erased the real cause of her mother's death, then that person was hiding something big. Meanwhile, Gabriel had managed to find an old folder in his father's office. Inside were a series of documents signed shortly before his death, all relating to the transfer of the company to his stepmother. But what caught his attention was a note scribbled on the corner of a piece of paper. "I spoke to him. He said I can't sign. But he insists. I need time." Gabriel felt his blood run cold. His father knew he was being pressured. But who was him? And why did he need time? Everything indicated that his father had tried to reverse the decision and was prevented. But by whom? And, worse, how far did this influence extend? Alana sat in the registry office, her heart racing as she watched. The clerk sifted through the records of Gustavo's supposed engagement. If there was fraud, the paperwork should show something suspicious. The woman typed calmly, unhurriedly, while Alana felt her nails dig into her palm. Then, finally, the computer screen flashed with a result. "Here it is," the clerk said, pulling out the document. Alana leaned forward, and her stomach turned when she saw the date of the registration. Gustavo and her friend were officially engaged, the day before her grandfather died. Not only that, but the registry office where the document was registered was in another city, miles away. "This doesn't make sense," Alana muttered. Her grandfather was already in the hospital at the time. How could he have approved this? Something didn't add up. What if someone made sure he never found out about this absurd clause being used against him? Bruno, meanwhile, was sitting in the small office of the accountant who had worked with his family for years. The man looked at the papers Bruno had brought, frowning. "This doesn't add up," he said, turning one of the sheets over to show them. "This signature doesn't look like yours." Bruno felt his blood boil. "You mean I wasn't the one who signed this?" The accountant shook his head. "Either you signed something without knowing what it was, or someone forged your signature. But I can tell you one thing, this contract was written in a very strategic way. It guarantees that Mateus would become the sole owner without needing your direct approval." Bruno felt his stomach churn. This wasn't a simple robbery. It was a scam planned down to the smallest detail. And if he had fallen into this trap, how many other people had also fallen into it? Juliana left the notary's office holding the documents that confirmed her suspicions. Eduardo had no right to the house. The problem was that he had already sold it, and now she needed to prove that the transaction was fraudulent before it was too late. Her next step was to find a lawyer willing to take on this fight. But as she leafed through the papers on her way out, something caught her eye. At the bottom of one of the documents, a name appeared as a witness to the transaction. It was the same name as the lawyer who had handled her father's will. A shiver ran down her spine. What if this person was involved in more than just her case? What if he was part of a much larger scheme? Rodrigo, still trying to understand how everything happened so quickly, arrived at the hospital where his uncle spent his last days. He needed answers. Talking to one of the nurses, he mentioned that there was something strange about the change in the will. The woman frowned, hesitant. "Your uncle seemed different in the last few weeks," she said, lowering her voice. "He was always a strong, lucid man, but suddenly he started forgetting things. He seemed confused, sleepy. And he had frequent visits from a lawyer." Rodrigo felt his heart race. Do you remember the name of this lawyer? The nurse hesitated for a moment, then wrote it down on a piece of paper. Rodrigo looked at the name and felt his blood run cold. It was the same one Juliana had just encountered. Camila held the mysterious lawyer's business card, feeling the weight of the discovery sink in. If this man was involved in so many suspicious changes, he couldn't be acting alone. Determined to confront him, she called the number printed on the card. After a few rings, a serious voice answered. Alencar Law Firm, good morning. Camila took a deep breath. I need to schedule an appointment with Dr. Alencar. It's about a will. The silence on the other end of the line lasted a second longer than usual. Dr. Alencar doesn't see clients directly. What's the specific case? Camila hesitated, but then, on impulse, blurted out, my father changed his will before he died, and I want to know why. The line went dead. Then, the attendant replied, in a lower tone, if I were you, I would be careful with that kind of question. Meanwhile, Gabriel was sifting through old documents in his father's office, trying to find any clues about the identity of the man who was pressuring him to transfer the company. That's when he found a payment slip, addressed to a name he didn't recognize, but which appeared several times among the papers. A quick search on his phone revealed that the name belonged to a legal consultant who had been named in several inheritance disputes over the years. It was always the same pattern: companies, houses, wills changed shortly before the owner's deaths. Gabriel felt a chill run down his spine. This man was no ordinary lawyer. He was an expert in ensuring that certain fortunes ended up in the right hands. And now Gabriel had to find out who he really worked for. Daniela couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much bigger behind all these stories. With the lawyer's name in hand, she decided to follow the doctor's advice and go to the hospital where her mother died. She needed to access the original medical records. However, when she got there, she was informed that the old files had been accidentally lost in a system failure. Daniela felt her breath quicken. It was no coincidence. Someone was erasing traces. She persisted, asking to speak to someone who had worked at the hospital at the time of her mother's death. After much resistance, she managed to get the contact information of a former nurse. When she called her, Daniela was met with an uncomfortable silence. I know why you're calling me, the woman said quietly. And what I can tell you is, your mother didn't die the way they said she did. But if you really want to know the truth, you need to be careful. Powerful people get involved in these cases. Alana, still analyzing the registry records, decided to confront Gustavo. If he really had forged the engagement to inherit his grandfather's fortune, he would need to have an accomplice at the registry office, someone who could approve the document without raising suspicions. She picked up the phone and called him. I need to talk to you. Now. Gustavo laughed on the other end of the line. Relax, cousin. Are you feeling jealous because I was smarter? Alana ignored the provocation. I already know that your engagement was registered the day before my grandfather died, and it was done in a city he had never been to. Now tell me, who helped you validate this paperwork? The silence on the other end of the line was enough to confirm her suspicions. Then, before Gustavo hung up, she blurted out, if you don't talk to me, I'll go straight to the police. This time, the answer came more hesitantly. Okay, let's talk. But you won't like what you find out. Juliana felt her heart pounding in her chest as she held the paper with the name of the suspicious lawyer. The same name Rodrigo had discovered at the hospital, the same name linked to several suspicious alterations in wills. This was no coincidence. She knew that if Eduardo had managed to sell the house, it was because this man had made sure the documents looked legitimate. But why? What did he gain from this? Determined to find out, she went to the address of the law firm. The building was sophisticated, discreet, the kind of place that hid secrets in the open. When she entered, a receptionist looked at her with an expression of rehearsed professionalism. How can I help you? Juliana took a deep breath. I'm here to talk to Dr. Alencar. The woman forced a smile. The doctor doesn't see people without an appointment. Juliana rested her hands on the table and looked the receptionist in the eye. Tell him I know what he did with my mother's house. The woman's reaction was instantaneous. Her smile disappeared. Without saying a word, he picked up the phone and began dialing. Meanwhile, Bruno watched Mateus from afar, sitting in a cafe, feeling his blood boil. The man he considered a brother had taken everything he had, and now he was living as if nothing had happened. Bruno knew he couldn't simply accuse him without proof, but he had to act. He picked up his cell phone and sent a message to an old colleague who worked in the legal field. I need help. Forged signatures. Corporate fraud. Do you know anyone who can dig deeper? The answer came minutes later. I do. But if you're going to mess with these types of people, be prepared. This could be much bigger than it seems. Bruno closed his eyes and took a deep breath. What had started as a personal betrayal now seemed to be part of something much bigger. And he was ready to find out how far this web of lies went. Rodrigo couldn't sleep that night. The nurse's revelation kept playing on his mind. If his uncle really wasn't lucid when he signed the will, who benefited from it? And more importantly, who made sure he didn't realize what was happening? He needed more proof. The next morning, he returned to the hospital and this time went to the in-house pharmacy to check the medications his uncle had taken in the last few days. Using a simple pretext, he managed to access the prescription list. And there, among the normal medications, was something that caught his attention, a strong sedative, something that could have caused mental confusion in anyone. Rodrigo felt a shiver run down his spine. His uncle didn't need that medication. So why did someone administer it? And who signed the release of the dose? His eyes scanned the patient's file until he found the name of the doctor in charge. And when he read the name, his breath caught. It was the same doctor who certified the cause of Daniela's mother's death. At the same time, Camila was about to enter dangerous territory. The law firm receptionist's warning echoed in her head, be careful with these kinds of questions. But that only served to fuel her further. Her father had tried to protect her from this scheme, but he never had time to tell her the truth. Now, it was her turn to put the pieces together. She decided to investigate the lawyer on her own and discovered a curious detail. He wasn't just an expert in inheritance disputes. His name was linked to an investment fund that, coincidentally, managed real estate and businesses that had changed hands after family disputes. If everyone there had lost something, homes, businesses, inheritances, who was this money going to? Camila felt a knot in her stomach. If she could figure out where all this wealth was being funneled, she might finally be able to get to the real culprit. Gabriel wasted no time. With the documents in hand, he decided to track down the legal consultant who kept appearing in his father's company records. He made a few calls, activated contacts he still had in the corporate world, and within a few hours, he had obtained information that made his blood run cold. The consultant didn't just work for his stepmother. He was a key player in a network of lawyers and businessmen who worked together to embezzle inheritances, companies, and assets from fragile families. And worse, most of the cases involved unexpected deaths, suspicious changes to wills, and last-minute property transfers. Gabriel felt his breath catch. This wasn't just any scam. It was a carefully planned scheme to profit from the destruction of entire families. And he, along with the others, had been one of the victims. Meanwhile, Alana had finally managed to convince Gustavo to meet with her. Her cousin arrived with a confident air, but she could tell he was uneasy, as if he knew the situation was about to change. Do you really think I'm going to let this go? She asked as soon as he sat down. Gustavo smirked. And what can you do? I already have the money. Alana leaned over the table. But you know this engagement is fake. The registry office where it was registered is too far away. My grandfather would never have approved it, and I can prove that you manipulated everything. Gustavo was silent for a moment before sighing. Do you really want to know the truth? He asked, his voice lower. This was much bigger than just me. I just did what I was told to do. Alana's heart raced. Who told you to? Gustavo hesitated. Someone who knew exactly how to make this happen. And who doesn't like to be challenged. Juliana felt a chill down her spine as she waited in the reception area of the law firm. The silence in the room was almost oppressive, and the receptionist, now visibly uncomfortable, avoided looking directly at her. Minutes later, the door to one of the offices opened, and a tall, gray-haired man with a calculating expression appeared in the hallway. Miss Juliana, I'm Dr. Alencar. I think we have something to talk about. He led her inside, closing the door calmly behind him. Juliana sat down at the desk and crossed her arms. I want to know how my brother managed to sell a house that wasn't his." The lawyer smiled almost condescendingly. "You're mistaken. Everything was done legally." Juliana threw the papers on the desk. "Then explain to me why the original documents say otherwise." Alencar's smile disappeared for a second. It was subtle, but Juliana noticed. He knew something was wrong. And, worse, he knew she was too close to the truth. Rodrigo, in turn, held the paper with the name of the doctor who signed both the prescription for his uncle's sedative and Daniela's mother's death certificate. He knew that this couldn't be just a coincidence. He picked up the phone and called Daniela. "You won't believe what I found out." When he explained, Daniela was silent for a moment. "So you mean the same person could be involved in my mother's death and in changing your uncle's will?" Rodrigo nodded, even though he knew she couldn't see him. "And there's more. This doctor's name was already mentioned in an inheritance dispute years ago. But the case disappeared before it went to trial." Daniela felt a chill. "We need to find him." Rodrigo agreed. And quickly. Because if he finds out we're investigating, he might try to cover his tracks again. Camila held the phone tightly, still trying to process the answer she had received from the law firm's attendant. "If I were you, I would be careful with that kind of question." That wasn't just any warning, it was a disguised threat. Her father knew something was wrong, but he didn't have time to act. Now, it was up to her to find out what was really going on. She decided not to waste any more time and went to the office's address. When she arrived, she observed the building from afar. It was one of those discreet law firms, with no flashy signs, just a small plaque next to the glass door. Before entering, she took out her cell phone and sent a message to Gabriel. "I think I found the thread that could pull the whole scheme together. If I don't answer within an hour, know that I was here." She took a deep breath and went inside. Inside the office, the atmosphere was cold and too silent. The receptionist, the same one she had spoken to on the phone, looked at her with an expression that was hard to decipher. "Dr. Alencar is not available at the moment," she said quickly. But Camila noticed something strange. At the end of the hallway, a half-open door revealed a muffled conversation. Before she could react, a man in a suit left the office, walking in the opposite direction. Camila recognized him immediately. It was the same lawyer whose name appeared on Gabriel's and Juliana's documents, and even on Marina's father's inheritance records. Her heart raced. She was in the right place. Now, she just needed to find out who was really running this dirty game. Gabriel received Camila's message and felt a knot in his stomach. "If I don't respond within an hour, know that I was here." This was no ordinary message. She knew she was walking into something dangerous. Without hesitation, she grabbed her car keys and drove straight to the law firm's address. On the way, she called Rodrigo and Juliana, quickly explaining the situation. Camila may have found the epicenter of the scheme. But if that's true, she can't be alone. Rodrigo, who was already investigating the suspicious doctor, quickly connected the dots. If this lawyer is involved in several cases, maybe he's covering up much bigger things. Juliana added, "If he's the one manipulating the wills, someone needs to be making sure that certain people die at the right time." The silence between the three was enough to confirm what everyone feared. They weren't just dealing with fraud. They were dealing with something much more sinister. Inside the office, Camila tried to remain calm. She felt the receptionist's eyes on her, but pretended not to notice. She needed to act quickly. When the receptionist was distracted by the phone, Camila walked discreetly down the hallway and stopped in front of the half-open door. The lawyer was talking to someone on the phone, his voice low but firm. "Yes. Everything is under control. The next one has already signed, there is no going back." Camila felt a shiver down her spine. The next one? Who else was being deceived at that moment? Before she could hear more, a crack echoed through the hallway, the sound of the reception door opening. Someone had arrived. Camila turned around slowly and froze. It was Gustavo, Alana's cousin, the same one who faked the engagement to steal the inheritance. He wasn't there by chance. He was part of the scheme. Camila felt her heart race as she watched Gustavo enter the office as if he were part of the house. He shook hands quickly with the receptionist and walked straight down the hallway, not even looking to either side. Camila pressed herself against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. If he was there, it meant he wasn't just an opportunist, He was part of the machine that was destroying entire families. She took a deep breath and cautiously peeked through the crack in the half-open door. Inside the office, the lawyer ended the call and leaned back in his chair, crossing his fingers on the table. "You took your time," he said to Gustavo, who was now sitting on the other side of the table. "I had to make sure Alana had no evidence before she came here," Gustavo replied. "But she's not an idiot. She's digging. Just like the others." Camila felt a chill run down her spine. They knew they were being investigated. Outside the office, Gabriel parked the car and looked around. Rodrigo and Juliana arrived almost at the same time, both carrying documents and notes that could be useful. "If Camila is in there, she could be in danger," Juliana said, closing the car door quickly. Gabriel nodded. "We enter as clients. No drawing attention to ourselves." They crossed the lobby and went straight to the receptionist, who looked at them suspiciously. "We have a meeting scheduled with Dr. Alencar," Gabriel said with a practiced smile. The woman didn't answer right away. Her eyes went to the hallway, as if she was waiting for someone. Juliana noticed and followed the receptionist's gaze. When her eyes found a silhouette at the end of the hallway, her blood ran cold. Gustavo was there. And he wasn't alone. Camila couldn't wait any longer. If Gustavo was there to discuss how to cover up the scam against Alana, he probably knew more about the whole scheme than she realized. With her heart racing, she discreetly picked up her cell phone and started recording. She needed proof. "The others are getting suspicious," Gustavo told the lawyer, crossing his arms. "I don't know how, but it seems like they've started to connect the dots." Juliana found something about her mother's house, Rodrigo went after his uncle's doctor and, worse, Gabriel and Camila are sniffing out this business about companies. This is getting out of hand. The lawyer sighed impatiently. "It doesn't matter. The contracts are signed, the wills have been changed, and the assets are already circulating. No one can do anything without proof." Camila gritted her teeth. But now she had proof. Outside, Gabriel noticed Juliana staring down the hallway. He followed her gaze and saw Gustavo talking discreetly to a man in a dark suit. Rodrigo noticed too. "We have to get Camila out of there. Now." Gabriel nodded and, without thinking twice, pulled out his phone and sent a quick message, "Get out of there. We're out here." Inside the room, Camila's cell phone vibrated in her pocket. When she looked at the screen, she knew it was now or never. Carefully, she stopped the recording, put her phone away, and walked away from the door. But just as she turned to leave, she felt a shadow approaching. When she looked up, she found Gustavo standing in front of her, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What the hell are you doing here?" Camila froze. Gustavo's gaze was cold, calculating, and she knew that any wrong move could give away that she had something against him. She tried to act natural. "I could ask you the same thing," she said, crossing her arms. Gustavo smirked, but his eyes scanned every detail of her, as if he was trying to decipher if she had heard something she shouldn't have. "Business, cousin. Only business." He tilted his head to the side. "And you? What are you doing here?" Camila forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "The same thing as you. Finding out what happened to my inheritance." The lawyer inside the room stood up and walked to the door. His gaze fell directly on her. "Camila Vasconcelos, we finally meet," he said in a drawling tone, almost as if he had been waiting for this moment. Outside, Gabriel, Rodrigo, and Juliana were growing restless. It had been too long. "She didn't answer the message," Gabriel said, gritting his teeth. Juliana took a deep breath. "We can't wait any longer." Without hesitation, she walked over to the receptionist. "Dr. Alencar said he was waiting for us." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, a door in the hallway suddenly opened, and Camila appeared. Her face was pale, but her expression was determined. Behind her, Gustavo and the lawyer watched intently. "So that's it?" Gustavo said, with a wry smile. "Do you really think you're going to get anything against us?" Gabriel stepped forward, staring at Alana's cousin. "We already did," he said, holding up his cell phone. He had recorded it too. Gustavo's smile faltered. The lawyer at his side kept his expression neutral, but his eyes flashed with a spark of irritation. Camila took a step forward, maintaining her firm posture. You thought you could keep fooling everyone. But now we have proof. The lawyer let out a long sigh and closed the door behind him. Proof? He laughed, crossing his arms. And what do you think you can do with a recorded audio? None of this proves that there was fraud. In fact, it only shows that you are desperate. But Gabriel didn't back down. A recording might not be enough. But we have documents, falsified records, and names that are repeated in several cases. Rodrigo took a step forward. And we also know that the doctor who signed my uncle's death certificate was the same one who changed the cause of Daniela's mother's death. The lawyer pressed his lips together. For the first time, he looked worried. Juliana took advantage of the moment. And there's more. The registry office where Gustavo registered his engagement is under investigation. If we pull the list of altered documents, I bet we'll find a lot more. Gustavo looked at the lawyer, waiting for him to say something. But this time, the man didn't answer. Gabriel smirked. Then let's see what the police think of this. He unlocked his phone and showed the screen. The recording was already being sent to a trusted contact, an investigator who worked on asset fraud. The lawyer slowly uncrossed his arms. You really don't know who you're messing with, he said, his voice now lower, full of threat. But it was too late. Camila lifted her chin. And you didn't realize you chose the wrong victims. The silence that followed was heavy. The lawyer narrowed his eyes, but maintained his posture. He knew he was cornered, but he also knew that people like him didn't fall so easily. You can try whatever you want, he said, calmly adjusting his tie. But cases like these take years to resolve. The bureaucracy, the judges, the appeals. Do you really think you'll get anything done before it's too late? Camila crossed her arms, not looking away. The problem is that you miscalculated. We're not alone. Gabriel nodded. You did this to several families. And now all these families are going to unite. Rodrigo added, and if you think you can keep covering your tracks, this time, the truth is already out. He pointed to his cell phone. The recording has already been sent. There's no going back. The lawyer gritted his teeth, realizing that, for the first time, his web of manipulation was about to crumble. Gustavo, who had been so confident before, seemed uneasy. He looked at the lawyer, waiting for some response, but all he got was a cold stare. It was every man for himself now. Juliana wasted no time. She picked up her cell phone and made a call. Hello? Yes, we have evidence. We need a team now. The lawyer took a deep breath and picked up his briefcase. This isn't over yet, he said, before leaving the office. But Camila knew it was the beginning of the end for them. When the door closed, everyone looked at each other, feeling the weight of that initial victory. They had done the unthinkable, defeated those who thought they would never be found out. But there was still a lot of work to be done. Justice wasn't served in a single day. But they were ready to fight until the end.